So we got 4 road poneglyphs in this world, and today I'm going to try my hand at cracking the mystery of where the 4th one is. And you might be thinking, wait, don't we already know that the 4th poneglyph is with the man with the burn scar, also known as Hinokizu in Japanese? And yes, that would be right, which is why I'm not going to focus too much on the who, instead I'm going to focus on the where. Where is this guy? But before that though, I want to share something with you that I found to be painfully funny. So you know how sometimes there are mistakes that happen on the weekly release chapters, like Oda forgetting to draw the spirals on Orochi's double fruit, or him drawing Kiku missing the wrong arm. So those mistakes happen, but then the mistakes get corrected by the time the chapter appears in its corresponding volume. So it turns out that in the most recent volume, which is 109, one of the corrections that was made, and I kid you not, was to add more ellipses to Vega Punk's speech bubble. Think about that. Somebody sat there, I don't know if it was Oda, it might have been, but somebody sat there and said, you know what correction we really need to make? We need to add more ellipses to a piece of Vega Punk dialogue. Let's add more dots. Seriously though, reading most of Vega Punk's message on a consistent basis throughout all these chapters has been the equivalent of me watching this scene from Toy Story on repeat.
It's a what? What is it?
Now to start off, I need to revisit Oda's Jump Festa statement for 2024, where he implied that he was thinking about not spending a whole lot of time in Elbaf. He said, if Luffy and the others can leave Egghead safely, they should be going to that island. I also consider not taking that route, but I may not be able to stop Luffy. And another translation of the same statement read as follows, if Luffy and his friends get out of Egghead safely, will they go to that island? I thought of a route to not go there, but I don't think I can stop Luffy. And so what this means is that at one point, in Oda's mind, Elbaf would be a skippable island, which is strange, but given where the story is right now, some of the most important giants that we know of are already in Egghead and have brought the Viking vibe with them already. So maybe that's what Oda meant, that he would still find a way of having the giants play a major role in the story, but they would ultimately end up doing so by running into the Straw Hat crew at some point outside of Elbaf. Now, I've already spoken about how Elbaf should be connected to the Peak of High West that connects to Skypiea, so maybe he was thinking about having the Straw Hats visit Loki in his castle in the sky or something like that. I just imagine Loki chilling in the clouds along with Uranus or something. And so maybe that Sky Island route was what Oda was thinking about when he said that he had figured out another way of us getting what we needed to get from Elbaf without actually landing there. Either that or maybe he was thinking about giving us some Elbaf related exposition via another character's flashback, kind of like what he did with Big Mom during the wedding, and then have the ultimate flashback, meaning Joy Boy's story, by the very end, be the one to fill in the gaps. Anyway, I'll circle back to Oda implying that Elbaf was skippable in a moment, because first I need to do a brief recap of who has what road poneglyphs. So Luffy technically has 3, the one from Zou, the one from Whole Cake Island, and the one from Wano. So technically speaking, the only road poneglyph that the Straw Hats are missing is the one that is said to be under the possession of the man with the burned scar. Kid had 2 road poneglyphs, the one that he took after infiltrating Whole Cake Island and injuring one of Big Mom's commanders, and the one that he got from Law by the end of Wano for helping out with the Alliance. And so with Shanks obliterating Kid, those 2 road poneglyph rubbings are now under his possession, and we don't know if he already has any of the other 2 poneglyphs that he would need, although if he did, it would not be that surprising because during Odin's flashback, we saw that he went to Zou, and he also went to Fishman Island back when the 4th road poneglyph was being kept there. Now in the anime, after Kid gets defeated by Shanks, he gets a fantasy sequence where he envisions himself being the winner, and in that sequence he actually tells Killer that they are now only in need of 1 more road poneglyph to reach the One Piece. Now there's 2 ways of interpreting that. One is that maybe Shanks actually did have a copy of either the Zou poneglyph or the Burnt Scar poneglyph, and that Kid ended up taking that copy from him after quote-unquote winning. And then the second possibility is that Shanks actually didn't have anything, but that perhaps Kid and Law made a deal off-screen near the end of Wano, where Law agreed to give Kid a copy of his Zou poneglyph in exchange for Kid giving Law a copy of his Whole Cake Island poneglyph. Regardless though, as of right now, we can actually just confirm that Shanks has at least 2 road poneglyphs. So Luffy has 3, Shanks has 2, and Blackbeard has 3. He got the one from Zou and Wano from defeating Law, and given that he sent Van Ogre and Aokiji to Whole Cake Island, it's pretty obvious that he also has the one that belonged to Big Mom as well. It makes no sense for him to send 2 commanders there to kidnap Pudding, which he needs to read the road poneglyphs and then not take a copy of the road poneglyph that Big Mom had in her castle. Especially since we did hear the Blackbeard pirates say that they were aware that she had one in her possession. Speaking of Pudding, we recently just saw that she's still in a cell, and since we recently saw Gin and Don Krieg walking around Hashinosu, and we know that Gin and Sanji kinda ended up respecting each other by the end of the Baratie arc, and Gin also told Sanji to tell Luffy that he hopes to run into him someday in the Grand Line, I think a good way of reintroducing him into the story would be to to have Blackbeard jailed Pudding in Hashinosu, and then have Gin be the one who breaks her out. We also saw Pearl hanging out there as well, and it took me rereading Baratie to remember that he could pretty much light himself on fire to fight. So there you go, man with a burned scar, confirmed. On a serious note though, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I'm a pretty enthusiastic supporter of the idea that the man with the burned scar / the Hinokizu is actually Scopper Gaban, or Gabin. I've given a ton of reasons for it already. I've pretty much driven that idea into the ground. And so I recently watched this video by Doc Sake where he explores the idea of the man with the burnt scar being Mask Deuce, aka Ace's number 2, also known as the vice captain of the Spade Pirates. Now I don't want to spend too much time on that because again, the focus of this video should be on the where instead of the who, but there is an aspect to Deuce's character that is going to help me make a point by the end of this video, so let's just look at it briefly. Now a big chunk of Dax's argument as to why Masked Deuce is the man with the burned scar is based off of the Ace novels that were released a while back, and I'm not going to go over every single one of his points. I'll just highlight 3 that I think are pretty solid. So the first one is that according to Lafitte, the man with the burned scar sails a ship that is completely black. And in the Ace novel we learned that Deuce tells Ace that when building a ship, it's important to char the wood because it makes the ship more durable and resistant to fire and water. Secondly, at the very beginning of the Ace novel, Deuce and Ace find themselves stranded on an island called Sixes, and the reason why the two become friends in the first place is because they have to work together to be able to find a way of escaping the island, because there's a bunch of whirlpools outside of it that prevent anybody from escaping. So it's essentially the exact same phenomenon that we saw happens in the outskirts of Wano. We still don't know what causes them, but Lafitte does say that if you try to get close to the black ship, a vortex will gobble up your ship. So it could be that at a certain point, Deuce learned about the source behind the phenomenon and was able to learn how to harness its power to be able to use it to his advantage. Sixes Island also makes an appearance in the One Piece Netflix live-action adaptation of the series. It's the island where we see Zoro fight and kill the original Mr. 7. So I wonder if that could mean that the whirlpools were deactivated by that point. And then the third point in favor of Masked Deuce is that by the end of the manga adaptation of the novel, he ends up sailing away with a flame dial that contains Ace's fire. So it could be that maybe he had an accident with that dial, and that's what caused him to be burned. Additionally, and interestingly enough, there are other key points from the Ace novel that could be pointing to Deuce showing up in what remains of the story in a significant way, such as his fascination with giants. We actually learned that one of his dreams was to be able to visit Little Garden. And what's crazy too is that in the Island of Sixes, which is where him and Ace get stranded, they find a huge Viking ship, which is obviously from Elbaf. And so they're looking for food to survive. And the only edible thing that they're able to get their hands on is the Mera Mera no Mi. So they end up splitting it in half and each of them eats one half. By the way, this is actually the source material that answers the question of what happens if 2 people take a bite of the same devil fruit. So the answer is that the first one to eat it gets the powers. But beyond that, the fruit was actually inside a treasure chest that was spat out by a giant bird. And it's later hinted at that the bird actually got the treasure chest by ransacking the Viking ship, which means that the Mera Mera no Mi that Ace ate was inside a giant Viking ship that came from Elbaf. So I think that's too on point for it just to be a coincidence. You know, the fact that the giants worship the sun god, and they just so happen to be carrying the devil fruit that has the power of the sun with them. And on that note, the sun symbolism was all over the place during Dory and Broggy's attack on Kid's ship in the anime. I mean, they even did the little Nika dance pose as well. Now I'll go back to the whole Deuce thing by the end, just to tie things up. But I think it was, 2022? Like, during Wano, right, at the end of Wano, Oda took a 1-month break. I'm sure you guys remember. And during that 1-month break, there were some official booklets that were published that were called Road to Laugh Tale. And in one of those booklets, we were essentially told that we could narrow down the location of the 4th and final Road Poneglyph to 3 islands. Specifically 3 islands that the Straw Hats are yet to visit. And so according to the booklet, the poneglyph can be in either Elbaf, Vira, or Hashinosu, also known as Beehive Island / Full of Lead Island / Pirate Island. Holy crap, that island has a bunch of names. So the reason for why I think it's unlikely for the poneglyph to be in Hashinosu is because if it were there, then that would mean that Blackbeard currently now has 4 road poneglyphs. And so all he would need to do would be to find a way of awakening Pudding's powers to get to Laugh Tale. It also would mean that at least one of the Straw Hats would need to visit Pirate Island to get a copy. So spending even more time there would end up feeling like a bit too much, especially if we consider that we might end up revisiting the island further during a Rocks Pirates flashback, because that's where the Rocks Pirates were formed. Additionally, it makes no sense for Oda to dedicate some panel time to Blackbeard and his crew talking to Kuzan about how they need to find this mystery figure with a burned scar if he was in fact close to Hashinosu. Because given the fact that Pirate Island is Teach's territory, it would kind of be like if somebody were to say, hey, we really need to get on this task of being able to find I'm this man that drives an ice cream truck that passes by my house every single weekend. And while you could technically argue that that scene at the bar might have happened prior to Blackbeard taking over Hashinosu via the Rocky Port incident, then I would severely question why Law has yet to make any sort of comment or move regarding going back to Hashinosu to get that poneglyph. You know, because Law was involved in the Rocky Port incident, which is located in Hashinosu. Plus, he also said that he trusted Robin, so if the mystery man is there, I feel like we would have heard Law say something about it by now. Another reason for why I don't think the poneglyph is in Hashinosu is because we've seen the area, and it's pretty lawless, pretty chaotic. Pirates can be seen there partying and moving around all over the place. So if the man with a burnt scar was actually around Hashinosu, I think word of mouth would have gotten around a lot more, and pirates would generally have a lot more info on this mysterious figure. Now, as for the reasons for why it would be unlikely for the Hinokizu man to be sailing around Elbaf, is that, as we know, the waters of Orland are full of giant animals and conflict, and so knowing that makes Lafitte's statement about the black ship being protected by whirlpools seem pretty incomplete, because I would imagine that if the Hinokizu was near the waters of Elbaf, Lafitte would have said something like, oh, by the way, you also need to be cautious about these giant beasts trying to jump at you unexpectedly from the water. Plus, you also have to be careful about not catching any strays from the constant giant-related conflict that surrounds the area where the Atom Tree is. But the biggest argument against the Road Poneglyph being in Elbaf is the statement from Oda that I showed you in the beginning, where he says that he was thinking about skipping the island altogether. So if the Road Poneglyph was there, the only way skipping Elbaf would work is if the Straw Hats were to get a copy of the Poneglyph from a character that had access to it, like Shanks or the Hinokizu himself. That, or like have one of the Straw Hats be sent to Elbaf via something like Kuma's Pawpaw fruit powers, and then have them make a copy and then reunite with the crew in the future. So now we can talk about Vira and why I think it's a really good possibility. Turns out that with the exception of Fishman Island, which I recently discovered gets name dropped as early as the Bharati arc, Vira is also an island that gets name dropped incredibly early in the series. Like, we're talking right before Logtown. And something I mentioned in this video is that given that we know that One Piece was not originally supposed to be as long as it became, the fact that the island of Vira gets mentioned so early in the series lets us know that Oda had an important purpose for it. And this is further supported by the fact that the island gets mentioned again right before Skypiea due to Nami reading the name off of Nolan's logbook. Now, when Oda was asked about Vira in an SBS, this is what he had to say. 400 years ago, when Nolan visited it, Vira was indeed just a merry town. But these days, it's a violent and dangerous country in the midst of a coup d'etat. But it's not really so much what's happening in Vira as what's happening all around the world at this time. I think you'll discover what I mean in the near future. Now you might say, wait a minute, Sawyer, didn't you just say that one of the reasons for why the Road Poneglyph likely isn't in Elbaf is because it's too wild of a place? And now we have Oda saying that there's a lot of chaos in Vira as well? And yes, point taken, but there's a fundamental difference between the chaos of Elbaf and the chaos in Vira, which is that the chaos in Vira is political. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that when we first heard about the three possibilities of where the fourth Road Poneglyph is, my mind immediately discredited and dismissed the possibility of it being in Vira, because I just thought, I mean, that island was mentioned so long ago in the pre-time skip, why would it matter now? But again, it being mentioned in the story so early is exactly why it should matter, and it should matter more than islands that are not mentioned in the pre-time skip. Just to give you a brief list, right, I showed you that panel of Fishman Island being mentioned in the Bharati arc. In Little Garden, we learn about Elbaf. We also hear about Wano in Thriller Bark, and it gets mentioned again in Marineford. But then another reason for why my first reaction was to completely discredit the possibility of Vira being the location of the fourth Road Poneglyph is because I was under the assumption that Vira automatically had to be in Paradise. I assumed that Vira would have to be in the first half of the Grand Line, so I just thought there's no way the Straw Hats are gonna just, U-turn their voyage, and then after all these islands that they're visited, they're gonna go back. Like, how long would that take? But then I looked into it and I realized that Oda actually never says what half of the Grand Line Vira is in. Now, every single Road Poneglyph that we know of has been in the New World. And there's actually a piece of evidence that points to Vira also being in the New World, which is that the log entry that Nami reads says that Nolan set sail from Vira 400 years ago. And 400 years ago is exactly the time where Nolan met the Tontada. And we know that the Tontada live in Dressrosa and Greenbit, right? And Dressrosa and Greenbit are in the New World. Now, the SBS that I showed you where Oda talks about Vira is in this volume, and it comes at the end of chapter 234. And just to give you an idea, like, this chapter is full of incredibly important people, major players. We have Sengoku, we have Doflamingo, Kuma, Mihawk is in the chapter, Lafitte is in the chapter, Whitebeard is in the chapter. Shanks is in the... Oh my gosh. This is literally the last panel of said chapter. Furthermore, the actual title of the chapter is Please Remember. So just imagine for a moment here that you're catching up with One Piece, reading it in volume form, and you just finished this chapter called Please Remember. And it's full of important characters. And the first thing you see after you're done reading it is an SBS of Oda talking about the island of Vira. Like, to me, that would feel like he's yelling at me. Hello, please remember, this island's gonna be important. But beyond that, something that I also recently found out about is that Vira was described as being a sunny town. Sunny town. Vira. Now, at this point, I really don't think I need to convince anybody about how significant it is that the island of Vira was called that. So instead, please enjoy this brief montage of Sunny-related images that we've gotten throughout the series. Now, given the mysterious silhouette that we see in the final spread of this week's chapter, this video of mine where I established the possibility of Shanks having a twin brother suddenly started gaining more views. And so for those of you who don't know, a big piece of evidence for that theory comes from Shanks' scar being visible in this profile shot of him while he's talking to Whitebeard, and then his scar mysteriously disappearing during the audience that he has with the Gorosei. Now, if this was just a random mistake, what's interesting is that it was not corrected in the volume. We could also note that the silhouetted man in the chapter appears to be holding a sword in a sort of like inverted reflection of what appears to be Shanks' pose. And something else that I've been saying for a while now is that if it does get confirmed that Shanks has a twin, to me that man also has to be Bonnie's biological father, which would obviously make Bonnie Shanks' niece. Now in chapter 1083, Dragon mentions that the influence of the Revolutionary Army has caused 8 countries to have successful revolutions. And then Ivankov says, yeah, and one of those was Lulusia, and you know that it's been wiped off the map. And since we already know that there's been a lot of political turmoil in Vira, to me it's more than likely that Vira was one of the 8 countries that rebelled politically as well. And if it's further into the New World, then that means Imu can't just wipe it off the map because it's too far away and the government doesn't have enough Mother Flame to fuel the ancient weapon to go ahead and destroy it. But what they might be able to do instead is to send a government representative there, such as a holy knight from the Figarland family to keep an eye on the political instability there, or at least somebody who can keep the Road Poneglyph from falling into the hands of pirates. And this would actually fit perfectly with a statement that Shiryu makes at the bar when discussing the Hinokizu, because in that flashback Shiryu says that he suspects that the man with the 4th Road Poneglyph actually works for the government because them having the Final Road Poneglyph would ultimately prevent a lot of people from getting to the One Piece. Last but not least, we have Film Red, where we see Shanks able to produce a powerful griffin image, and this feature was also carried into the anime. And I've often spoken a lot about how Oda likes to hide canonical hints in the movies that he's involved in, and so in that scene, we also see Shanks igniting his sword on fire. So, if it turns out that he has an evil brother, maybe the reason why the Hinokizu has a burned scar is because Shanks gave it to him in a fight. Finally, the 4th Road Poneglyph being under the possession of Shanks' brother could also make sense of why it was that Shanks was holding off on making his move for the One Piece for a long time. So maybe Shanks already knows that his brother has the Final Road Poneglyph, but just feels very torn and has mixed feelings about fighting him again. Now, if this possibility turns out to be true, then this would also serve to explain why it was so important for Katarina Devon to touch Saturn before leaving Egghead. Because by transforming herself into one of the Gorosei, she would be able to approach this black ship, approach this man burned with a scar, and say, hey, let me see that poneglyph that we entrusted you with. Now, obviously, there's questions that come up with this possibility as well, and I think the feature of a good theory is that you try to punch holes in it, and it still stands. So, for example, if Shanks' brother was entrusted with keeping the 4th Road Poneglyph safe from pirates, then what was he doing in Marijoa during Reverie? Was he just taking a break from his poneglyph guarding duties or something like that? And I would say, well, it's important to remember that, if he is the Hinokizu, then that means that he's aboard a ship. So it's not like he's fixed on one location. He can sail around. The important thing is that the Straw Hats, or that us as readers, run into him in Vira. Second of all, he's going to Marijoa, which is the headquarters of the world government, so I'm pretty sure that he must have had a plan, or at least had contact with some of the higher-ups to come up with a plan to not keep the poneglyph unattended. Now, on that note, you could also ask, wait a minute, if that's the case, why not just have the road poneglyph in Marijoa instead of moving it around? And I would say, I think maybe there's 2 reasons for that. One is that not all the world nobles know about what happened during the Void Century. As we recently learned from Charla or Charlia's statement, She doesn't know anything about the Void Century. So I think if somebody were to pull up to Marijoa with a giant block of stone that's red with an ancient language on it, a lot of the world nobles would be asking questions that maybe the top brass doesn't want them to be asking in the first place. In addition, and this goes back to the point that Shiryu made, if you have somebody that works for the government actively protecting this Final Road Poneglyph, then the reason why it's important for them to be outside of Marijoa is because once somebody tries to get that poneglyph, they can sound the alarm and tell the government, hey, this guy, this person is getting really close to finding the One Piece. So we really need to send some backup here real quick. Kind of like what's happening with the Gorosei in Egghead. Speaking of Saturn, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who thought it was super weird that in this week's chapter, we literally cut away right as he's falling into the water. It's like, why do that? I've given my answer plenty of times, but it's because they're not weak to the sea. They don't share that weakness with other Devil Fruit users because the Gorosei are not normal Devil Fruit users. In fact, I don't even think they're Devil Fruit users. So yeah, they just don't have that. Like, it's happened enough times where Oda has hinted that, you know, these guys are not weak to the sea. Now, another question that comes up here is, if the man with the burnt scar is sailing around Vira, guarding this road poneglyph, and if the island of Vira is occupied by the Revolutionary Army, or at least we know that the Revolutionary Army has a lot of influence over the land of Vira, then why didn't Dragon tell Robin about this mysterious figure, or about this road poneglyph during the time skip? And to that I would say, well, why didn't Robin tell Luffy that Sabo was alive? Or like, why didn't Neptune tell Robin that there was actually a road poneglyph in the sea forest a long time ago, right next to the one that had the apology from Joy Boy? So it might just turn out to be an example of One Piece's writing not being perfect, or it could also turn out to be that since we know that there's been a lot of conflict in Vira, the world government is actually going out of its way to make sure that the person who's in charge of guarding the poneglyph is able to keep a low profile, even when around Vira. And in fact, that actually goes hand in hand perfectly with what Venus Judo tells the person that we at first assumed to be Shanks during the reverie, which is that considering his status, he should try to stay away from politics. Now, going back to the whole masked Deuce thing, Deuce's goal was to be able to write the greatest adventure journal ever. And so by the end of the manga adaptation of the novel, Deuce starts working for Morgans. Now, he doesn't tell Morgans everything, so even if he was the guy that had access to this road poneglyph, he wouldn't share that with Morgans, because by the end of the novel, Morgans actually asks Deuce to give him a copy of the story that he wrote about Ace. And Deuce says, no, I'm not going to give that to you. That's not for sale. I'm not going to let you publish that story. So he said no. But Morgans was like, okay, fine, whatever. I'll still keep you on the payroll because you're really good at writing stories. And so by the end, Deuce says, okay, I'm down with that. I'll write stories for you. But I'm particularly interested in writing about Luffy and the second in command of the Revolutionary Army. So if one was interested in writing stories about Sabo, the Flame Emperor, and Luffy, the Sun God, where would one go? Perhaps the once known sunny town of Vira would be a good place to start, because it's associated with the Revolutionary Army. This also kind of goes into like father-son reunions that we know need to happen. We know that Usopp needs to reunite with Yasopp, and since Luffy is Oda's golden child, you know, he's the favorite, then that meeting between Usopp and Yasopp has to happen before Luffy reunites with Dragon, or meets Dragon. So if Luffy's ever going to meet up with his father prior to the final war, I think the sunny town of Vira would be the perfect place to hold that meetup. So long story short, whether you believe that the road poneglyph is with Deuce or with Bonnie's father, the point of the matter is that this road to Laugh Tale at some point will lead to Vira. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed some of the points that I made throughout this video, you know what to do. Take care. We'll catch you guys later. Bye.